Welcome to the first sewing marathon of 2024. I'm Beth and today we're going to be sewing up the Tuesday tote from Knotted Threads. This pattern is the perfect pattern to start the new year with our sewing marathons. It comes together really quick, but there's so many different things you can do to this pattern. The designer came out with the original version and then later decided to come out with an add-on to it that has every possible version you can think of. My version today is going to be exactly reflective of how I'm feeling starting off this new year. In 2024, I'm focused on only having things I love and bring me joy in my sewing room. I want beautiful prints, I want amazing patterns, I want my sewing room to be a place of joy and therapy and comfort. This pattern fits perfectly there. I know a lot of people say, oh, it's just a tote pattern, but there is something magical about this pattern. Today, my version is going to be focused on bringing back the joy into your sewing room. We're going to talk about how to make this pattern quickly so you don't get stressed out in the sewing room. We're going to talk about using a couple of small ways to make it a little bit fancier, but we're also going to be talking about how to keep it on a budget and how to sew it in production style. So if you're someone like me who does sell at craft shows, or if you want to give these as gifts, this is a way to use your sewing room to spread joy, to spread love, to bring in a little bit of extra income for your family or whatever you need. So a big thank you to Knotted Threads for allowing us to sew this pattern. Thank you for all the other sewists that are sewing and taking the time to make these tutorials, and especially thanks to everyone for watching. We love doing these and we are so thankful that you guys join in and chat with us and connect. So now let's go ahead and get started talking about the pieces we will need to create our Tuesday tote. I'm going to be focusing on adding a few small techniques that won't add a lot of time to your sewing, but will add a really cool visual impact to the bag. I'm going into 2024 with the mindset of using what I have in my sewing room in creative ways. For this pattern, these pieces are going to be kind of big, so I'm going to try to show everything on screen with my camera angle really good, but if you can't see anything, I'm sorry about that. I'll go ahead and apologize in advance. So let's start first talking about our strap. I'm going to be using webbing. I'm going to be using ugly webbing. This webbing is not webbing I like to use. I have switched to using seatbelt webbing, and I like it better, but you can see where this is just kind of like, this is the kind you use in the garage or something, but I have it. It's not going to waste it. Also had a whole drawer full of ribbon. So what I did was I found this ribbon, and yes, it doesn't match this perfectly, but it's close enough for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ribbon and I'm just going to attach it to one side and sew it on there. So one side will look a little fancy, the other side will be plain, and it's just going to be, I think, a really cute addition. Another way to use this webbing, if you have webbing like this also, is that you can cut a fabric cotton woven 4 inches wide, and then do the double fold where the edges are all encased and stick this in there inside, and you wouldn't have to interface, so you would save money on interfacing while still using up this webbing. So that is one way that I'm meeting my goal of not only using the materials I have, but also sewing beautiful things quickly and easily. For this bag, I'm also going to be adding piping. This pattern, if you have on your goals for 2024 to learn a new sewing technique and you're not good with piping, try it here. Try it this way. This is going to be the easiest way to get started with piping. So I just have 2 pieces of piping. This is piping that I bought years ago on a big spool from Amazon. I will continue to use it until it runs out, but this is going to be a great addition to this bag just to give it a little extra pop. I have my 2 bottom pieces. This is just a cotton woven. I interface with a medium weight interfacing. I went ahead and cut out my 2 box corners, and I do have 2 pieces of this. So this will be the front, back, bottom, exterior. For my top, I am splurging here. I know I should not be splurging, but I am. First thing is I'm using this awesome material. But not only is this print beautiful, this is a brand new base that I have not used before. I wanted to try it out and I'm so in love with it. And so I'm going to limit myself as to how much I can buy, but I've already bought 5 yards. This is called Dragon Sheen. That's actually the name of the base, and not the print, the base. This is really unique, and I really don't even explain it, but it's kind of like silky and really smooth on the top, but on the back, it's like soft and just kind of, not fleece, I don't even know, maybe cottony, I guess I should say. But not only is it water resistant, but I don't need to interface anything, but it doesn't feel plasticky. There's no plastic feel to this. It's very soft, it's very malleable, and so I'm kind of obsessed with it right now, and I did buy quite a bit. But anyway, part of my 2024 goal is also to have beauty and things I love in my sewing room. I will occasionally splurge, so the way I'm balancing this out is I'm using some things I don't like and I'm splurging on a couple others. So this gorgeous print and dragon sheen can be found at J&R Edwards. I will have the link in my description, of course. I also took the time to add a tag. I have really been enjoying adding tags. The tag is from Heartwood and Hyde. What I do is on this one, I really wanted to make it kind of a feature focus. So not only did I add the tag, I added a backing. I just glued the tag on, then stitched around it. Then I put some rivets onto another piece of vinyl. So you can see it is quite the feature there. It is big. It definitely looks about the size of a license plate, but that's okay. This piece and this piece are your top, front, back, exterior pieces. So the way this bag is going to look is I'm going to have the top, the bottom, and the little row of piping in between. Is that not gorgeous? Typically, whenever I do the lining of the Tuesday totes, I usually choose a non-directional print, because after I complete my exterior portion, what I usually do is I'll lay that all out and then just cut my lining from that, because it saves me a step. I'm going to talk more about that once I get to that part. But for this one, I wanted to use more of this dragon sheen because I bought it and I'm in love with it. And so for this one, I'm just cutting out the two pieces according to the pattern measurement for the lining. Not interfacing, not doing anything with it, cutting and going. Now, if this was a non-directional print, I would have done it differently, and I'm going to tell you when we get to that step how I would have done it differently. And the last thing I'm going to have is two pieces of foam. I love the structure that foam gives a bag. A lot of people don't like it. My foam is thick. You don't have to use foam. You could use a fleece. You could use nothing at all, but I like just a big solid bag that stands up. Lots of times I keep these in my trunk, and so whenever I open up the trunk, I want everything to be standing up and neat and organized. It's not flopping over. Whenever I put groceries in and at the store, it stands up on its own for easy loading of my groceries. So I'm using foam. This is a non-fusible foam. I buy my foam in a bolt from Amazon. So I mean, like, it's like a 6-foot bolt. Now that we know all the pieces and how quickly it would be to cut these out, because they're just basic rectangles. We don't have any crazy shapes or anything like that. We are ready to get started sewing up our Tuesday tote. I had forgotten to cut out the corners on the bottom of the lining to make box corners, so I wanted to show you that you do need to cut those corners out there as well. And also I want to tell you that I'm not attaching my foam until after I complete my exterior. I'll be waiting on this step, so my foam will be unattached and attached later, and cut out the two corners on your lining. So I'm going to set those pieces aside. I'm going to pull out these pieces. My two top pieces I'm setting to the side. What I'm going to work on first is going to be adding the piping to the bottom. Piping is something I've kind of gotten really into doing and perfecting. The things you need to know on the piping is you have the actual piece of piping inside, and then you have the tail. The tail is the most important part, because this is what we want to use for the measurement to make sure we have it placed properly. I'm going to sew this piping onto this bottom piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's going to be perfect for me because this tail is exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So my needle will fall right there before that piece of piping starts. That makes it easy, since this is going to be perfect, that I can line up the raw edges of both evenly and just stitch across. I'm going to do a basting stitch first, and then when I attach this bottom to the top, that's when I'll come in with that full seam allowance. But for example, if you had the same piping that I had and you wanted to attach the top and you wanted to sew it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, what you would do is you would just offset the raw edge of your piping 1/8 of an inch away and attach it that way, so that your piping would still fall exactly where you need it to on the front of the bag. This is if you're using pre-made piping. If you're using your own piping, you can cut it to whatever size you want so that you can always match up those raw edges. Since I have this, I'm going to make it easy for myself, and I'm just going to sew it with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so I don't even have to think about it or anything like that. But piping on a straight edge, super simple. You just match up those edges and sew it, and it's going to fit perfectly. It's going to add just a little bit of contrast to make the bag have just a little more fancy, unique feel. So I'm going to sew both pieces of piping on. And then I'm also going to take my webbing. So like I said, this webbing's kind of ugly, but I don't want to waste it. I'm simply going to add this ribbon and sew down both sides all the way down to attach it. So it just gives it a better look while I'm cleaning out the drawers that I haven't used in a long time in my sewing room and making use of these supplies I have on hand. So those are the two things that I'm going to do to get started sewing my Tuesday tote. So now I have the webbing and the ribbon attached. So I have my strap ready to go. I'm going to set this aside. I also have the piping attached to the bottom exteriors. So I'm going to trim up the piping because I cut it a little bit longer than I needed to. So I'm going to get that trimmed up. Now what I need to do is I just need to take this bottom piece, pull out a top piece, and orientate it the way it's going to look, and then you simply flip it down and you're going to sew these two pieces together. If you are in a really big hurry, you could always just use the lining measurements for this pattern and cut out 4 pieces and sew them and make a quick tote. That way you just won't have the contrast. Or if you wanted to, you could cut out 4 pieces of the lining and then cut out 2 raw edge pieces for the bottom and just add an overlay to the bottom of the exteriors. There's so many ways you can make this pattern even quicker than the way I'm going to show you. It's just an amazing pattern. So I'm just clipping along the bottom here. I'm going to do this on both of my pieces. to create the exterior. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew right up against that piping. It's going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but what I want to do is I want to take my foot, and I do have a skinny foot on my machine, but it still won't get as close as I want it to get. It'll try to make this foot be up against the piping, which would put my needle stitching a little too far away. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make sure I keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance, which will mean that one leg of my foot will be riding on top. It's a little trickier because you have to kind of keep a little more pressure there. So what I do when I do this is I just go slow, but I'm using my fingers to make sure I know where the piping is. I'm watching my seam allowance, make sure I'm keeping that proper seam allowance. So I'm doing all those things at once, and that's why I'm sewing it so slow, even though it's just a straight line. Okay, so after we get done sewing, we're going to pull it apart and see how it looks. Everything looks great. I'm going to top stitch along the bottom and have the seam going down. So I'm sewing through the seam of the top, the bottom, and the piping. I'm going to sew about 1/8 inch away. I like it to be like really close to the folded edge. So this is how the front of my bag will look. I'm going to repeat this same process on the back exterior, and then we're going to attach the foam. So let's go ahead and I will finish the second one off camera, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about adding the foam. So now that I have sewn together the tops to the bottoms of both the front and the back exterior, it's time to go ahead and add it to the foam. I went ahead and did this piece on the back just so I have that taken care of, and now we're going to do the front together and basically only have a few tips to give on this. If you have a walking foot, it's definitely going to make this go easier just because it pulls the foam at the same speed as it'll be pulling the top. And that helps that to not get any bunching or bubbling, whatever you might get sometimes when you add fabric to foam. I don't like to switch out my walking foot because it just takes a little bit of time. I'm kind of lazy like that. So what I do is I start sewing the top first. I switch my stitch length to about a 4.5 to a 5. So while I'm sewing the top, I'm just applying some pressure and making sure everything stays straight while I'm doing it. I do the same thing down that first side. But then when I come to the bottom, I start applying like not a lot of pressure. I'm not pulling hard, but I start holding and pulling a little bit tight. I don't want any sometimes when you sew it, it's kind of loose or floppy, and I don't want that. I want it kind of attached firmly. I don't like to fuse this because whenever you turn a bag and you fused foam, sometimes you get wrinkling, and I hate that. So my best tips is to just kind of pull tight. So since you already had this stitched here, when you're pulling, you're getting out any of that looseness and that bubbling and things like that. But I go slow, I don't rush it. Keep that stitch length long, and it should be perfectly fine. So I always cut my foam a little bit bigger. After I sew this, then I'll have to trim that all down, and then our exterior is done and ready for us to start attaching it. So now I have the front, exterior, and back completed. What I want to do now is going to be the first place where I really deviate from the pattern. I like to do this pattern as a drop-in lining. You can do this pattern as it's written as a birthed bag. I honestly feel drop-in linings are easier and quicker. You don't sew blind. And instead of sewing the top right sides together and then turning it and then top stitching, you skip that step and you just do the top stitching. So that's why I feel it's a time saver. Also, when you put the lining in, if you feel like, oh, it's a little too baggy, it's not fitting properly, you can just fold the lining down more to get the fit you want. I prefer it. You can do what you want, but I suggest you try one and see what you like to do. So before I attach the exteriors together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a fold line. The fold line can be any measurement you want it to be. You could fold it down an inch, you could fold it down a half of an inch, a quarter of an inch, whatever you want, because the only thing it'll do is make your tote a little bit shorter, a little bit squattier, depending on how far you fold it down. So I'm going to do 3/4 of an inch. So let's draw that line right on there. I'm going to do this on both pieces of the exterior and both pieces of the lining. After I get my sides sewn, I'm just going to fold down to that line. So you can see you're not losing a lot. It's almost exactly the same that you would use for your seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that line on my other piece, and then we are going to start sewing it together. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my two exterior pieces right sides together, and I'm just going to clip along the bottom. So let's go ahead and just sew along this bottom portion, not the cutouts, back stitching when you start and stop. Now that I have that bottom sewn, what I'm going to do is I'm going to butterfly that seam. I'm going to open this up and sew 1/8 of an inch down each side away, 1/8 of an inch away from that seam I just sewed. This is going to help the bag to not only stand up properly, but also the lining to fit easier. And I just feel like it looks better. You can skip this step if you're in a real hurry, but even when I'm in a hurry and I'm batch sewing, I don't skip this step. I just feel like it's that important. Now, when I'm typically making these for craft shows and a lot of gifts all at once, what I do at this point is I take this entire piece over to my lining. I would use a non-directional lining, which is what I almost always do, and I fold that lining several layers deep, so maybe 4 layers, and then I cut this piece out. By doing that, I save the time of this stitching here. I don't have to stitch across the first time, and I don't have to do the 2 rows of top stitching. Is that a big time saver? You better believe it is whenever you're doing, 10 of these in one day. So keep that in mind if you're trying to batch sew. Wait until this step. Cut out all your linings at once with a non-directional print. If you feel like you have a cotton woven and you need to interface it, great. If you use something like this dragon sheen or a cotton canvas or waterproof canvas, you do not have to interface those, and it's another time saver. For me, on this video, I'm choosing to be a little fancy, and I'm using a directional print, so I am not cutting mine out. I'm cutting the 2 separate pieces, and I am going to have to attach my lining. I will attach the 2 lining pieces. Let me pull them out. I will attach them the same way I just did this. So I will take the lining pieces and right sides together. Draw the lines on your lining at the top, the same as you did for your exterior, and then sew across the bottom. At this point, everything we do for the exterior will be exactly the same for the lining. So after we get our lining sewn, the lines drawn on, we will also then, just like we're doing for the exterior, clip it back together. I always start here with my pretty little seam. That's where I start clipping first. I don't care if I have to trim at the top or bottom. As long as that seam matches up, I'm good to go. So we are just clipping all along on both sides. Then we are going to sew along both sides with the seam allowance given in the pattern. We will do this, like I said, exterior and lining. Match up that seam first. And you're ignoring this line for right now. You're going to sew from the bottom all the way to the top. This is just for when we fold it down. So sew from edge to edge on the sides. Now that I have the right sides clipped together along the sides, I'm just going to start sewing at the top, back stitch, go all the way down to the bottom. And then we will come back and box our corners. I'll do this on both sides and, like I said, on the lining also. Sides are sewn. I'm simply going to open up these bottom pieces. I'm going to butterfly that seam right there so I can match them up exactly. Push those two seams together. And hope I don't break a clip. I'm the hardest on clips. I think I just manhandle my clips or something. They're always breaking. Seriously, after I finish sewing a project, it's like a clip graveyard all along the floor. I don't know why. I just don't understand. And it's not like a specific type of clip. It's all clips. Like, there's not like, oh, well, it's just that brand. No, it's every clip I get my hands on. I just break them. So I have to like buy them in huge boxes because I go through them so much. Okay, I'm just sticking my finger in there to smooth out this corner just so I don't like sew over a pleat, pucker, bunch of fabric, whatever you want to call it. Now what I always like to do is straighten this out really good because I want to make sure it's like straight and I sew it straight. So if I would just kind of have it like that, I might not sew it as good. So I always just kind of push it down so you can make sure you're going to get a straight, even sew and that everything looks good. Go ahead and sew it with that same seam allowance, back stitching when you start and stop. Okay, so this is done. I'm going to flip it right sides out. And at this point, I'm going to take all the time to poke out my corners, get everything nice and neat, see if I need to redo anything. So now what you're going to do is you're going to take this raw edge and just fold it to that line you just drew. And let me show it this way so in case you can't see it. So what you do is you take this raw edge and you just push it down to that line. And if it goes over, it is not a problem. It's not going to affect anything. The main thing you want to do is after you get this all clipped is to look and see if it looks straight. It's not even going to be perfectly straight because nobody's going to notice. But if you notice, if you're looking at it and you see, oh, that looks really off, or that's very noticeable that it's uneven, then fix it. But if you can't notice it when you're looking for it, I promise no one else is going to notice it when they're not looking for it. The seams on the side, I'm going to butterfly the seam on the sides and then fold them down as well, keeping them both butterflied just to help spread that bulk on both sides so I don't have a huge lump there. So I'm going to continue clipping all around this top, all the raw edges folded down. I'm hoping you can see that. I'll lay it down too, but this is what that top edge looks like. And there's the inside of the bag. So everything's clipped. We'll leave that over there for a minute. Now, due to the magic of editing, da-da-da, I have the lining already done. So, the lining is completed the same way as the exterior. The only thing we're doing differently is we're not turning this one right sides out. We're leaving it wrong sides out. Everything's clipped. And you just put it in there and you're done. Let's do it this way. It's so hard to get perfect angles on video. So what I do first is I match up my seams. And if I did everything correctly, I'm not going to have any problems with this fitting around the perimeter. I'm going to pull it down to my lap. I hope you can see this okay. So what I'm doing is I'm simply pushing those two, the lining folded edge and the exterior folded edge together. Since I'm using the same print, I don't even have to worry about if the lining shows because it looks exactly the same. When I use a contrasting lining or something different, I will lots of times just shift down my lining, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. But with this one, I can keep them flush because it is not going to matter. You won't be able to tell where they look the same. So do your side seams and then go ahead and clip the rest. There went another one. I told you, it just happens. I'm horrible with clips. So go ahead and clip all the way around, matching up those seams. And then we're just going to add our handles in, sew it, and we're done. Broke another one. Look, see, I told you. What am I doing wrong? That's what this video really should be about. Help Beth quit breaking clips. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. I think I'm just like gripping them too tight. I should use these videos as kind of like a therapy session for me so you guys can fix all the things that's wrong, like all my broken clips and all my sewing issues. Look guys, I'm not lying to you. That's another one. Help me, please, help. So that's like, what, 3 clips in this video? And your bagging will look like, oh, it's too big. You just have to spread it out. It's going to fit fine because as long as you got the same measurements, of course, and sewed with the same seam allowance, it's just always a little like you have to spread it. Okay, so now what I do is I'm putting my hands in there and just kind of spreading it out, making sure everything looks good. So now the handles. I basically eyeball this, but I'm going to show you how, whenever I'm doing them quickly, I just eyeball this. But let's just go ahead and do it a little bit better. Let's fold that together. This is going to be my center point right here. So from my center point, I'm just going to kind of measure them evenly, and I'm going to slip them in there. I'm going to slip them in maybe an inch, inch and a half. And then when I sew around, that secures them. If you're nervous, if you're like, I don't feel comfortable with just that row of stitching, you can add a rivet, of course. This is the way I always do them. I've never had any problems. The handles for me don't really matter too much as to where I place them. I just use kind of some common sense and put them in there. I do keep them symmetric, and I do check them against the other side before I sew everything down. If you want to be... Guys, I'm not even kidding. I usually edit all these broken clips out, but I'm leaving them in here so you guys are my witness and to help me see what I'm doing wrong. I think it's a conspiracy, but I seriously, I need help. I'm not going to edit these out. I'm going to leave these in here. So I got the one side in. I'm measuring. I'm going to do that same measurement on the other side, and then I'll do the same on the back. You can definitely make a mark like right here, like, oh, I want it to go down this far, and so then you push it into that amount on each of them if you want to. If you're like, I want to make sure I'm precise with it, you can do that, or you can just be like me and hold it up at the end to make sure it looks really good. Okay, and then what I do is the lazy way, and I just push these two pieces together to find out where I put the other pieces of the webbing, straps, whatever. Okay, now before I sew, I want to make sure I got them about the same length. I'm going to push my seams together, make sure they are almost the same side, and now I just sew. I am okay with sewing from the inside, but if you're nervous, you can flip this and sew from the exterior. While I'm sewing, I do make sure I'm not, like, my straps aren't pulling out, and that I'm not sewing over any like puckers, and that my lining's not creeping up over my exterior. I definitely wouldn't want that. Even though they match, I wouldn't want that to happen. And my beautiful Tuesday tote is completely done. I love the way these always turn out. I think they're so beautiful and can be packed in so many ways, so many different ways you can do them. If you buy the add-on for this pattern, you have all the options for how to do a recessed zipper, for how to do a dividing pocket, zipper pockets. Again, I want to thank Knotted Thread for letting us sew this pattern on our very first sewing marathon of 2024. Like I said, we're going to have one every month, or at least that's the plan. And I want to thank everybody for making the tutorials, for making this a fun day of sewing, and for everyone who's watching these videos and connecting with us. If you have any suggestions for a sewing marathon, please let us know. If you are someone who makes YouTube videos and you want to join us, we are always open. Anybody who wants to join us can join us. Just let us know and we will put you in the group. So I hope so far in January 2024 you've had the time to create something beautiful and you're bringing love and light into your sewing room. Thank you so much, and I can't wait to see you for the next sewing marathon in February.